Welcome to segmented turning, section number 7. And this is going to be the last one, but I'm going to give you the guidelines that would help you come up with your own feature ring design by showing you two and talking about a third. And what I'm doing here, you see I don't have my smock on because I'm not turning today. There was a lot of woodworking in one of these, and I've pre-recorded that, and we'll show you that section in a couple minutes. But first thing I want to show you is one of the simplest of the feature rings that we can do, and it's called the Greek key. And basically it's just an up, down, square arrangement of segments. So this is a piece we did a long time ago, but let me show you the piece I just made for today's discussion and demonstration. This is a Greek key, and I made it out of 24 segments and 24 spacers. And in this particular project, it came out looking, I think, appropriate for the size. Let me show you how that's done. The first thing you do is you take your two species of wood and you laminate them together into a pair. And when I cut my segments, I have these typical segments like that. But I also calculated, I didn't mean to knock it over, but I also calculated what the dimension for the spacers need to be so that they represent exactly the same proportions. So to do this Greek key, all I did was to take every other segment, turn it upside down, and put the appropriate spacer in between, like that. And glue that into a ring. Now that's pretty small. They don't have to be that small. I just chose to make it kind of tiny. That gives us this effect right here. And I've used bloodwood and yellowheart, two very stable species of wood, and they don't splitter out very much. So when I sand up the joints and clean it up and put that together, I don't have a lot of loss. So this is cut on the standard sleds like I showed you last week. The spacers are cut on that spacer sled that I showed you in the last video. And the segments, while they're small, are cut in exactly the same way. The first thing, of course, is to make the laminate. So that's easy to do. Majority of this work turns out to be woodworking and requires a table saw and appropriate sleds to get those joints and those angles as tight as we can get them. Greek key, very simple design. And again, one of the other things I want to talk about, this one I use no spacers on either side of it. This one, there are 3 veneer rings on either side. Black, white, black. So I glued the first spacer, first veneer on, clamped it, let it dry, glued on the second, and the same in the third. And once those 3 are clamped on and dried, then I trimmed them roughly. Added the segment ring. These are all individual steps, done one at a time. Same thing done from the top down. So remember, with working with veneer, we need to keep clamp pressure on constantly while it's drying. I allowed at least 2 hours between each glue up here. And then on the top, you can't hardly see it, but there is one single black ring here. And on the bottom, as you can see, there are 3 rings down here too. I think adding these veneers in these various locations adds a crispness to the vessels. Something to think about. Well, let's show you something that's much more complicated. And this is one I get asked about a lot. And this is what I call the Thunderbird design. And it is not difficult to do either. The key to all of these projects are taking care, labeling your steps, and cutting very precisely. Well, here's how you get to this. I made a vessel for us to work on today, and it has both the Thunderbird and it has a diamond pattern in here, alternating between the two. And I put a ring on either side. This is Wenge, W-E-N-G-E, Wenge. Wenge is an interesting dark wood. It's very porous, and when I look at one plane, it looks very marbled. When I look at the other plane of it, it looks very striated and very regular. I rotated the species of the wood so that I had this striation on here. I put one large fat Wenge ring here, glued it on, cut it in half, set half of it aside for later, and then turned it down to a little over 1/8. Glued it up, and on the top then, I did the same thing. I glued the other half of it on here and turned it back down to 1/8. So there's a lot of things happened in this vessel. Split ring by gluing a fat ring on and splitting. Also, you can see I used my floating foot. The species here is the same as the background on the feature. Now here's another thing that happens on small vessels, or any vessel, where there's a major curvature. Each of these rings down here are exactly the same width. It looks like they're the same width up here, aren't they? But they're not. Because the line is constant coming up like this, it's very easy to make each layer appear to be exactly the same thickness, because they are. But as the curvature turns inward, I'm no longer looking at it from the side, but I'm looking at it from a oblique angle, and each ring then begins to appear larger and larger. So what these are significantly thinner rings. These two on the top are almost half the thickness of these down here, and what they appear now as if they're the same because of that angle. So there's a lot of things here to think about. As the vessel turns, is it important that you keep that look the same or not? Is it important to separate your design with a band of some other color? Whether you want to put a floating foot in or not. So these are the little subtleties in vessels that are segmented. Well, how did I get to that piece that I now call a Thunderbird? This little tiny one. And this vessel, they're much larger. And the difference between these two is the angle at which I cut the wood. Let me show you this, and then we're going to go to the video and you can see all the steps. I'm going to set these aside. If I cut my background species at a fairly narrow angle like that, I'm going to get a very small design. As the angle increases, the design becomes larger and larger. On this piece right here, the cut angle was 20 degrees. On this piece right here, I really don't know what it was, but you cut the maple and flip one piece. And without changing any of your angle settings on your sled, don't touch a thing. Cut the insert piece at the same time so that you know they're going to perfectly fit. The angle is a little less important than the fact that nothing changes when you make this cut. You may return the sled to 90 degrees to make a trim, and you may reset it again for the next piece. But when you reset it, cut all this for the next piece at one time. So we cut this, and then we get into the next stage of woodworking. We glue it up. And in the video you're going to see in about a couple of minutes, you'll see gluing this thing up is a little tedious from the standpoint that this piece in the center, when clamped, is going to want to slide out because the glue being slippery. And if you put veneers in on either side, as I do, clamping has to hold this down, has to hold this together, has to keep it flat. And I've made a little 90-degree sled simply to hold these pieces in place while I do those cutting. So here, glue up, and then back to the table saw to cut them into individual strips, like so. Now, the saw I'm using has an 1/8 inch kerf. That means between each of these pieces, let and I can't stack them up. But you understand, each of these pieces, there's an 1/8 of an inch kerf missing. So these look like a stair step. And that's good. If the kerf gets smaller, then this stair step gets smaller and the design doesn't work near as well. So I cut each of these strips to be about an 1/8 of an inch wide, and there's a split between each of them of an 1/8 of an inch. And then for whatever design you want to create, the process is simply to rearrange these pieces until we get this. This is exactly what I've shown you with these strips rearranged until I was satisfied with what it looked like. There's other designs that can easily be created in exactly the same way, including if I cut this and took 2 of these and put them together, I've created a small diamond. And I've done that here in this vessel. So let's see all those steps together. I'm going to cut the wood, I'm going to glue it, I'm going to cut it into strips, and then I'm going to assemble those strips into a vessel design and then cut the segment up. Now, when I cut the segment, because the length of these pieces may not be identical, it's really important that you establish a line right down the center of your segment and cut half of it to one side of that line and half of it to the other side of that same line. Not measuring from the end, always measure from the center out. And you'll see on my final video piece that I'm cutting to a line that I've drawn down the center of the piece. So look for that line. Let's go to the video and take a quick look at all these steps put together. I'll be right back. helped you understand a little bit more about the steps I go through in making the Thunderbird design and diamonds and so on. This is the last in the series we are putting together for segment and turning, but I want to let you know that everything we've covered and other things are in that book I wrote a couple of years ago. So in the very beginning, all those steps about how to cut segments and how to build a vessel, featuring what we just talked about right here. It's right in chapter number 5. But there's a lot of other information in here which we've just never got around to. We're not going to do anything on what's called open segment work. But it's another variation where the pieces do not touch each other and requires a little different assembly technique, a little less accuracy in cutting the segments. So it creates this lacy kind of effect. We also didn't deal with things like segmented pins and stuff like that. And there's a bunch of other ideas in here about the sleds, about how to cut things at oblique angles and get some interesting additional patterns. So for review, you've got the whole series to go back and forth to see, but you also have this source which you can pick it up from Amazon or any of your other book dealers. Well, thanks for hanging in there with us throughout this whole series on the basics of segment and turning. Remember to subscribe. We need your subscriptions, and we always look at your comments and appreciate your feedback and suggestions. Click on the little bell. You always get notified when the next video comes out. Where we're going next is going back to some basics, but from an entirely new direction. So come back for our next video. Thanks for watching.